Hey, it's awkward back here. I do interviews with what I like to call social justice warriors. Interviewed a few people in the past and then kind of went silent. It's mainly because Twitter these days is my main form of disseminating digital messaging, and a hacker took control of my Twitter. I was off for 2 months. Thankfully, Shahid Batar, Access Now, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation helped me out despite all of Twitter's efforts to keep me off. I am back, and my first interview, I'm very glad to have Janos Marton. We've been talking for a long time now. I've always been impressed with what he stands for. And we're going to talk about some current events as well as his background. He was recently, up until maybe a week ago, running for Manhattan DA and decided to step down. So I'm certainly interested in why he made that choice, what went into that thinking, and what he's got planned for the future. Just a little bit of background on Janos. Obviously, as a man running for DA, he's an attorney. He calls himself a criminal justice reformer. I hate the word reform, so I'm going to ask him what he means by that, because I think that he probably is a little more radical than what that term implies. He was born and raised on the Upper West Side, but the perceptions of the Upper West Side are not necessarily Janos's experience. He was born to immigrant parents from Hungary and India, and he was, raised in a rent-controlled apartment and attended high school on a full scholarship. As he put it on his website, as a young man of color growing up in the 1990s, New York City, he experienced firsthand how tough on crime tactics like stop and frisk eroded the community's trust in law enforcement and failed to promote public safety. I certainly experienced that myself. I lived in New York City for many years. I moved after meeting my wife, who didn't want to live in a crazy big city. And back in 2014, I made a video with the New York Civil Liberties Union about mass incarceration and police brutality. And in that video, I kind of acted a bit and demonstrated how I see this. I'm standing on a street corner, snorting cocaine in public, and the cops basically say hi. Meanwhile, a black man is sitting on a stoop and doing nothing and gets guns pointed in his face. So Janos, after all that, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here.
I appreciate your time. Before we get into some of your background and, what I'm really curious about, the whole DA situation, because I was really excited for your candidacy. If I still lived in Manhattan, I certainly would have voted for you. But there's a couple things that have been going on recently. The one that pretty much everyone is talking about right now, whether they're focused on criminal and racial justice or not, is the so-called stimulus bill. It includes $33 million for democracy programs in Venezuela, 1.4 billion for Trump's border wall, $2 billion for a space force. It gives tax breaks to racehorse owners. It makes healthcare more affordable for Congress and gives us $600. What are your thoughts on where we're at with that?
Yeah, I mean, what we talked about constantly on the campaign, and what I've always tried to impress upon people who don't follow criminal justice and social justice work, is that the path to public safety is by investing in communities that have historically been marginalized and maligned and not given the same opportunities to succeed that others have. And you don't have to take my word for it. Basically, every time there is major civil unrest in this country and they put together some blue ribbon commission, whether we're talking about the 30s or 40s or the Kerner Commission in 1968, the conclusion is always the same, that people need to have access to stable housing, good education, and good job opportunities. That's what they're asking for. That's what they've been asking for generations, and they've never really gotten it. And this, the stimulus relief bill is just the latest example where people are suffering. There's great hardship going on all over the country, including in New York City, where there are more people accessing food pantries than ever before, where unemployment is incredibly high. And it's just extremely disappointing that this is the best that they can come up with. So that's definitely, my overall view on it. If I had to pick the one silver lining, amongst the disappointment of the stimulus, is that Pell Grants for people in prison were brought back partially for the first time since
Wow.
since the early 2000s or late 90s, and so that was the work of certain advocates who have been pushing for that for a very long time. And what we know about prison in the United States is that it is absolutely not a place of rehabilitation like it is in so many other countries. And that's why people who come home from prison often struggle and wind up cycling back into prison. But people who get an education in prison are far more likely to succeed, I should say. And so, again, this is an example of where investing in people is for everyone's benefit. And so I'm excited to see that at least that part slipped in somehow.
Wow. I am so glad I asked you that question. When I talk about, when I'm on the other side of the camera and I'm explaining abolition and our program 10 Demands for Justice, that's one of the things I always refer to. The term penitentiary came from penitence. They were initially, at least the argument was that they were for rehabilitation as well. And it's the Pell Grants, the making of the Pell Grants no longer being accessible to people in prison to get their education was like so symbolic. I always refer to it as an example, a primary example of exactly what you said. The prisons are not for rehabilitation here. They're for, punishment and profit. So that's incredibly exciting. I'm glad that you have you see the bright side, as my late mother would say. And I didn't know that.
I tend to be a pretty optimistic person. It's sort of essential for my line of work, I think, given how much negative stuff that we see every day.
Yeah, maybe that's why you get more done than I do. So that's really great news. There are two things that I think about related to what you said. One is, this is directly related to COVID, obviously, although you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell from much of the 5,000 page bill. There's also the other part of it that almost every single person in Congress, Democrat and Republican, voted for this, many of whom never even read it. So I'll start with the first part of that and state for the audience, in case you missed it, that 1 in 5 people in prison has COVID. I've been writing for months now about how the way we, and I'm not the first to say that the way we treat our incarcerated is, symbolic or representative of our society as a whole. And certainly, in an ideal world, we would not have prisons. So when you look at it on a larger scale, how you treat, the needy, people who have been victims themselves, people who are not given the same opportunities and put in positions where they may have to commit crime, how we treat them says a lot about who we are. And from the beginning, the hot spots within the hot spots have been nursing homes. So we don't care about our elderly, and the incarcerate, prisons and jails. Now, even if 7 out of 10 people in jail had been convicted of a crime, which they haven't, even if this vast majority of people in prison weren't nonviolent offenders, which they are, it still is a humane choice to make the right, to implement the right measures to protect people. And that's not what's happening. So what are your thoughts on, to me, what seems like, 1 in 5 is a staggering number?
Sure. And, just because I didn't do a whole wind up and stump at the outset. I should just say for people watching that, when I ran for DA, it was on the premise that jail and prison is not the answer to society's problems. And that's been essential to the work I've been doing for a number of years before I ran for DA. And you look at the context of this COVID crisis, I've tried to be of assistance to people getting folks out of jail and prison here in New York. We had some success during early COVID with respect to lowering the number of people on Rikers Island. We were very unsuccessful in getting people out of New York State prisons, which are run by Andrew Cuomo. And, when it comes to the jails, right, people who are pre-trial, around the country, there have been a lot of semi-successful efforts to reduce the jail population in places because of COVID. And what's striking to me is that people in those jurisdictions, such as DAs, judges, elected officials, have taken the position that because it's COVID, because it's a health emergency, they're willing to consider letting people basically do what any wealthy person does in this country, which is fight their case from home. And I think given that the sky hasn't fallen as a result, we should take as a lesson from that, that we shouldn't normally be locking people up pre-trial. I mean, to me, locking people up pre-trial is in direct contravention of the foundational values of our country, which include the notion of innocence or proven guilty.
Yeah.
So I think it's been interesting to watch how some places have actually been okay with releasing people pre-trial because of COVID. And I would just hope that they recognize that there was never actually a public safety reason to lock people up pre-trial in the first place. Now, with respect to prisons, people who are already sentenced, it's been much more of a mixed bag. And like I said, here in New York State, Governor Cuomo has been very, very reluctant to grant clemencies, even to people who have served 30 years of their sentence, have impeccable prison records, who already had clemency applications in before COVID. I mean, there were some real layups and softballs for Cuomo to basically let people come home when this pandemic was ripping through the prison system, and he refused to act. And frankly, there have only been a couple governors around the country who have been better on this issue. And I've struggled to figure out why, if there was ever going to be a reason for clemency, it would seem like this is the exact moment for it, right? To have mercy when people are risking death in prison, when, like you said, I mean, with very few exceptions, people are not there for life sentences, right? So to lose their life in prison because the state cannot handle an outbreak is just disgraceful. And so, as I look at what work I'm going to do next, which is likely going to be, working back on criminal justice issues around the country, I hope we can impart upon governors, both Democrats and Republicans, that, clemency is an awesome power that ought to be used exactly for moments like this. Yeah.
And that actually perfectly leads me to my next question, or comment/question. I know that you're not a vote blue no matter who, nor am I, of course. I, have seen in your work at the state level, you mentioned Cuomo, your efforts leading Close Rikers, dealing with de Blasio. You're not afraid to take on Democrats or Republicans, obviously. There's this notion among those who are not deeply ingrained, the vast majority of people who have registered Democrat, that they're the good guys. But we see time and time again, certainly with our only option other than Donald Trump, our only realistic option being the guy who wrote the crime bill, who was a segregationist. They're both corporate parties, and we're kind of confined to this corrupt two-party system. What are your thoughts on the possibility of a third party, on, the having to stand up to Democrats, and what has your experience been, honestly, in dealing with one versus the other? Have you even seen Democrats being more, what we'd like to believe, that they're more open to these ideas that we have?
Yeah. Well, I've definitely taken on Democrats for a good chunk of my career because I'm a progressive. I believe in that we need good, honest people in government and leadership, and we need to have values that empower people through our policies. And so In New York, that's brought me head to head with Democrats before. You mentioned a couple of them, right? When I was investigating public corruption for something called the Moreland Commission about 6 years ago, I investigated Democrats, Republicans, and Andrew Cuomo. It was my investigation into Andrew Cuomo that eventually got our whole commission shut down. So that's the origin of my relationship with him. You're right that during the Close Rikers campaign, we targeted Bill de Blasio, who was, obviously a Democrat, and hard to remember this, but at the time, doing very well for himself and sort of introducing himself nationally. And then, of course, Cy Vance, right, who I ran against just now. And all indications are that Cy Vance is not running for re-election. And I think that's in part due to the pressure that not just myself, but a couple of my fellow opponents put on him, scaring him out of entering into a contested primary. Most of my career work has been taking on Democrats. When I was at the ACLU, I was coordinating criminal justice initiatives around the country. And what was interesting to me is that, there are some Republicans who are expressing an openness around criminal justice these days, which is quite new. And it often is Republicans who are in conservative states rather than purple ones. And the idea there is that in purple states, Republicans often see criminal justice as a partisan issue, that activists tend to come from the left. And so by definition, Republicans are antagonistic towards them. Whereas in a place like Oklahoma, for example, where Republicans control everything, they don't really see it as a partisan issue. So if you go to the Republican governor of Oklahoma with a criminal justice proposal, he's more likely to weigh it on its merits. So I found that dynamic to be interesting around the country. Yeah. I do think that, there are definitely some, Democrats who certainly, like in the district attorney area, people who I look to for counsel and who I've been in touch with, like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, Sarah George in Burlington, Wesley Bell in St. Louis. There are some good folks out there. I mean, I'm generally of the mind that the American political structure does not accommodate really for third parties in a meaningful way. So I'm just here to cause trouble in the Democratic Party for now. But that's sort of where I've landed.
Gotcha. Just because I wasn't planning on asking you this, but because you brought up other district attorneys, I'm curious about two others. The newly elected George Gascon in Los Angeles, who, from what I've seen, has been the most radical yet, doing away with, so many things. I mean, I'm sure you know what they are, but mandatory minimums among, so many others, cash bail, all these things that are written into the 10 demands for justice, which are exactly the things that when we discuss our long-term goal for abolition, we say can happen immediately. We believe it can happen at all levels, and he seems to have put in place that happening in, a very kind of tumultuous city with a long history of racial discrimination and so many other things. So I'm curious about him, and also someone else. Actually, the first interview I did was with Mike Schmidt, the DA of Portland. He ran on a pretty progressive platform. He has experienced a ton of pushback from both sides. He's been a target of threatened violence. In fact, he and I both received death threats after our interview. Andy Najo, I apologize, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, was targeting us specifically, wrote articles about us, and he wasn't the only one. Meanwhile, friends I have in Portland who are to the left of Mike are pretty pissed off that he hasn't done something about the cops who have brutalized protesters. They're calling, it's interesting because they're, I believe they're, at least in their heart and mind, abolitionists, these people, but they're also calling for, the cops to be tried. So my response is, and I also think if you could touch on this part too, as someone who's in the system, you know, you endorsed 10 for Justice. Mike didn't. How do you even, this is a long and multifaceted question, but
Yeah.
how do you also, as a separate note, like kind of believe that we, you know, how do you endorse an abolitionist platform, but also work within a system where you're kind of parts of it, you're continuing that system? You know, because these people are saying to me they should be tried. My response is they need to, you know, repair. They need, there needs to be a different form of justice, you
Yeah.
know?
So, in general, when we talk about abolition, we talk about how do we hold people accountable in a way that breaks the cycle of harm without incarceration. And
Yeah.
you know, when we talk about police officers, you know, we actually have a simpler answer in front of us than we do in a lot of complicated areas, because when a police officer does harm, and let's remember, in terms of, you know, the legal structure itself being heavily weighted towards oppression, that it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3 to prosecute a police officer, right? Because they would mount a very rigorous defense, and I think it's no guarantee that Mike Schmidt would successfully convict a bunch of police officers, even if he brought the case, given the way the legal system is structured. That said, I think the main way to hold police officers accountable that breaks the cycle of harm is to remove them from the police force. And now, obviously, if you have a shooting where a person is killed, then that's different. But in most cases of police violence, police corruption, police misconduct, what do you really want? You want this person to stop being a police officer who carries around a badge and a gun with the weight of the state behind them. And I think, to me, that is a outcome that gets at what we want, without endorsing this notion that we need to put a police officer in jail when right at the same time we're trying to get people out of jail. So that's sort of my response regarding police officers. You know, with respect to George Gascon, I think, you know, it's important to, I'm going to give the movement credit and then I'm going to give it a critique, right? And I think, you know, where I'll give the movement credit, right, is that I don't think a person like George Gascon, if you look at his longstanding track record, I mean, he comes from law enforcement, I don't think he would have landed where he is today in Los Angeles with this extremely bold platform if he had not been pushed and supported by a lot of folks in the movement out in California who have made these issues politically viable and who are going to give him political cover for doing them. Now, obviously, he's facing huge pushback from his own assistant district attorneys, and that's going to happen in every office when you bring in this kind of reform. But similarly, you know, with Mike, I think Mike's doing a good job in Portland, and you know, Portland is an area that has long sort of teed up having this kind of transformative justice. So when you look around the country and you see progressive DAs, you know, they are a product of their system, which is a good thing, right? We want district attorneys to reflect the community values of the places they come from. So these are not superheroes coming in on a cape, right? These are people being elected because of the groundwork done in communities. Wesley Bell was elected in St. Louis because of the work that Ferguson activists did for 4 years before his election. That's a good thing. So that's where I'll give the movement credit. You know, where I'll offer a critique is that I think in a lot of parts of the country, activists have to decide if they are invested in the political system or they are not, because you can't, on the one hand, be critical of elected politicians not doing exactly your bidding if you're not willing to commit to the other part of the political process, which is helping people get elected, you know, going to bat for that elected official when they do the right thing. And I think there are some on the left who are much more comfortable criticizing the imperfections of progressive and leftist politicians than they are actually putting labor into helping those people win office against better funded, powerful machine candidates who would be worse on their issues. And so for me, you know, I got into activism in, you know, late 1990s, early 2000 when I was a teenager, and I came into politics a couple years after that when I wanted to get rid of George Bush. And so for me, it's been almost 20 years doing both activism and politics. And I think they're different things, but to be truly effective, you've got to really look at both.
I couldn't agree more on all fronts. I've been pretty disappointed at the nitpicking and the rushing to judgment and the canceling on the left. You know, we have not been successful in pushing the Democratic Party left. They're moving ever more right. Meanwhile, we, and we're, very critical of those very few progressives who do get in, in the case of Cori Bush, where I spoke up on her behalf and, received a lot of vitriolic pushback from people who normally support my views, because what I was saying was that she hasn't been sworn in. She has a lengthy history of working in the community. She's a Black Lives Matter activist. She's, a Black female, a Black feminist who was elected to Congress. Are you telling me that, like, if you had an opportunity to sit with Clyburn and possibly convince him of your beliefs, you wouldn't? Like, the things people are saying about her simply for taking a meeting, or they didn't like the tone of her tweet about it, to me, that was, quite over the top. And I don't necessarily see those same people doing the legwork to get more Cori Bushes into Congress. So I certainly agree with you there. It's interesting you mentioned George W. Bush. Also, I was protesting, I was, leading an action at his inauguration, and was cordoned off by the Secret Service, I believe. They took my mask off and took a photo of me, and there were sharpshooters on the building above. That was probably the scariest moment I had, doing the street stuff. And now people on the so-called left, although not true leftists, of course, people, put George W. Bush on a pedestal, and use him to say, like, how bad Donald Trump is. It's amazing how short our memory is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what more can I say to that? I completely agree. I mean, for anybody who actually, was organizing and living through the George Bush years, particularly that awful second term, that's about as bad as it gets. And, I think obviously Donald Trump is a worse human being, but there are so many lives adversely affected policies. It's just staggering that debilitating.
Yeah, for real. All right, so let's get into some of the, I'm glad we've touched on your past experiences that, have led you kind of to this point. The one last question I'll ask about that is, certainly experiencing being a person of color, in the era that we grew up. We're probably about the same age, in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, New York City. I suspect that just experiencing that, and also probably being around a bunch of rich white people on the Upper West Side, and not being that, was one of the things, or the couple things, or two of the things that, certainly radicalized you, so to speak. Was there any specific instances, any experiences in more detail, or, that jumped to your mind as to, why you took the path you did?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are sort of two sets of moments that really shaped me quite a bit. I mean, one is, as you alluded to, growing up on 100th Street, I had access to great education through a scholarship for high school, and so had a lot of opportunities with respect to that. But yeah, this was when Giuliani was really ramping up, the so-called quality of life crackdown, and what that really meant was an open invitation to harass, particularly young Black and brown people. And I was definitely subjected to what we later called stop and frisk. We didn't really have the terminology for it then. But as an example of how it would manifest, one time I was coming home and I swiped my student Metro card by the Port Authority. And, when it's a student Metro card, it makes a different light than a regular Metro card. And these two undercover officers grabbed me, and they threw me against the wall, and they said, "Where'd you steal that student Metro card from?" I was 17 at the time, definitely hadn't stolen it. And I couldn't produce an ID, because when you're that age, you don't really carry around an ID. And so they opened my bag, poured its contents onto the ground. I suppose they were looking for guns or drugs or something. And when they didn't find anything illegal, they gave me the student Metro card back and left without so much as an apology. And, it was a very humiliating experience that I think, is the kind of day-to-day humiliation that a lot of young people of color experienced in New York City then, and to some extent still do today. I mean, that those practices haven't stopped, even if they're somewhat reduced. And I'll also say that, I went to school, there were other kids there on scholarship, and particularly for my Black friends and classmates, that experience was, significantly worse than mine as a brown kid. And, that always lasted with me. And particularly, I remember, you're right, there is a contrast between the more affluent white kids in the school like that. It is New York City, so I would say, most of my classmates were still pretty liberal, but I remember particularly Amadou Diallo was killed, and the jury verdict that came back, acquitting the police officers happened when I was in high school. And I remember one of our Black student leaders had, planned a march out of classrooms for when that happened. And, all the students of color left, and most of the white kids did not. So, there was certainly, a contrast there. But, so those experiences, to be honest, mostly made me angry at police, angry at the institutions, at law enforcement. And I had dabbled in social justice stuff, but not really. I was still pretty young. The second thing I would say is, when 9/11 happened, I was really angry at the way President Bush, who we just talked about, used what was such a horrific tragedy for us New Yorkers as a call for war. And that honestly is what put me over the top into becoming an activist. I started voraciously reading everything I could on the nascent internet, and I joined every club I could on campus. I went to protest the war in Afghanistan, and before how it is, before I knew it, I was coordinating protests because, it's like, who's going to raise their hand to do the next one? And it was really off and running from there. So I think those two sets of events really are what triggered my involvement in movement work.
Yeah, interesting. And other than having the privilege of my skin color, our experiences are, pretty similar in how that trajectory. And obviously, like I said from the beginning, I fully supported your campaign. You really stood out to me. Even if you hadn't endorsed, the 10 kind of 10-phased approach toward abolition, just some of the things that you were writing about, your platform, I saw a focus on decriminalizing race and poverty, which is kind of the way that I look at all of this. And, if you could, kind of summarize for me, how you would describe your platform, from your perspective, and also what do you believe differentiated you, needless to say, from the guy you were going to run against, but also from your the other people running for the position?
Sure. So, when I was running the Close Rikers campaign, I had a 2-on-2 meeting with Cy Vance and with his deputies, myself and Glenn Martin, who is the founder of the campaign to Close Rikers.
Well, I'm also interviewing in a few weeks.
Oh, excellent. And, we were at the time, we're trying to get Cy Vance to commit to not sending anybody to Rikers Island for misdemeanors. And, he was sort of hemming and hawing, and finally you have to understand, the kind of person we sent to Rikers Island for misdemeanor, they've been through our court 5 or 6 times for the same thing. What else are we supposed to do? And I think that comment from him and my response to it is really encapsulates what's the difference between what he and a lot of the traditional DAs and DA candidates are offering and what I'm offering, which is, if I see the same person show up 5 or 6 times in criminal court for the same thing, obviously the criminal court system is not working. Obviously the current system is broken. It is not helping that person and is actually not keeping the community safe because it's not solving whatever underlying issue has brought this person into our criminal courtroom. So, I was running on a platform that called on using jail and prison as a last resort to basically eliminate the use of pretrial detention except for very exceptional circumstances, which is why we called for cutting the jail population by 80% in Manhattan. It called for reforming the way we sentence people. the boldest sentencing reform in the United States, a 20-year cap that would, basically be the maximum sentence that would bring us in line with other countries. And, in addition to being a cap for the longest sentences, that would right-size the rest of the sentencing system that we have. It called for ending the war on drugs, eliminating the Office of Special Narcotics Prosecutor, which is one of the driving forces behind the war on drugs in New York. It's a position that the Manhattan DA's office largely funds and staffs, and so the DA's office actually has a lot of say in abolishing that office. So that's sort of on the decarceration side. There's a whole bunch of other things too. We had 9 policy papers altogether: restorative justice, change the way we deal with intimate partner violence. And then the other side of the coin, how do we go after special interests who are never held accountable normally in our political and legal system? That's another area that distinguished me from Cy Vance, who was notorious for letting rich and powerful people off the hook. So we talked about holding landlords accountable who harass tenants, holding employers accountable who steal wages from workers, and generally having an environment where we're going to hold powerful politicians, developers, and people who commit environmental crimes accountable. So that was what we ran on. I think some of the successes of our campaign is that most of our policies became adopted by criminal justice groups and left-wing advocacy groups as the gold standard. For example, in a questionnaire that just went out to all the candidates from 20 criminal justice groups, they asked whether the other candidates would commit to an 80% decarceration goal, which was literally the main platform that we had run on for a year. So I think we succeeded in framing this conversation, getting the 8 other candidates, including some of whom who have no background in criminal justice, to come along and commit to certain principles and policies around decarceration. And so, I'm really proud of the work we did there. And then on an organizing standpoint, really focused on organizing and directly impacting communities. That was made much harder by COVID because we had a really good door-to-door program that we were doing and street outreach program that we were doing. And, we had to put all of it on hold and switch to phones and text and digital, which I think we did quite admirably, but, it's just not the same, especially when you're trying to reach marginalized communities. Like, the in-person connection is just so much stronger.
Absolutely.
So, that was all good. The ultimate reason that we suspended the campaign was very simple. It just had to do with money. Not that we didn't have enough money to continue paying our team and going on, but the unfortunate reality of our political system, and this is definitely true in New York, is that how much you've raised is considered a measure of your viability and a measure of your support, even if there's other better metrics to show those things. I mean, so we had, more than 2,000 donors, we had a couple hundred volunteers, but the only number that really mattered to a lot of organizations, including organizations on the left, was how much money we had raised. And in that area, we badly trailed some of our opponents, and we had sort of gotten the message that those organizations were going to stay neutral or endorse one of our opponents for that reason.
Wow.
And so, we spent, the first 2 weeks of December really kicking the tires and seeing if there was a way that we could significantly boost our fundraising. When we decided that there was not a way to catch up with our opponents in that regard, we could have kept going. We could have been, one of those famous, protest candidates where the person's in it for the debates and all that. But that was never what this was about. I mean, if we're not running to win this race, then I didn't see the point of putting my team and my supporters through that. And especially in a year where the left vote is divided already, I thought that'd be irresponsible. So that's why we made the decision to suspend the campaign. But I was quite clear in my statement that the only reason was because of money and the way our campaign finance system rules our politics. And I try to be clear about that on the way out so that people can consider this as an example of how money in politics affects outcomes. Because you always hear, money controls politics, but I wanted people to understand how. That in the DA race, you can give a $37,000 check to a candidate, where for us, our average donation was $50. So it would have taken, more than 700 donations to catch up with that one donation, based on how we were fundraising. So, I was disappointed that we had to do it, but I think at the same time, I'm really proud of everything we accomplished, and we'll very much stay on top of these issues in whatever capacity moving forward.
Yeah. I was going to say it if you didn't, that it's certainly telling. It's certainly an example of one of the major issues in politics. You are trying to help the people, as your shirt says, and the people don't have $37,000. So even if you have a lot of people, as you said, if it doesn't add up to a certain number, and it's disappointing to hear that the numbers of donors is not more important than the number of dollars to these leftist organizations as well, who I would, I think it's fair that you didn't call anyone out, but, I have to imagine that some of these are, ideologically right in line with you. And if everyone is now being asked whether they're willing to adopt the policies that you included in your platform, clearly you were leading the way. And, it sucks that it's about money and not policy. So, I also want to commend you for everything you did, and not only what you and your team did in terms of getting your messaging out there, influencing the conversation going forward, but this is maybe unusual but this stood out to me. I haven't seen that many people going out of their way to highlight the people who've worked for them either. I really saw you. Jenna Rosen really stands out to me, but you did it multiple times. Trying to shine a light on the people who normally wouldn't get a spotlight, who work their butts off for someone else. So, I guess on behalf of all the people who do a lot of grunt work and don't get credit and, maybe don't have the background or whatever to be on the forefront, thank you for that. That's very cool.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, and I've been on the other side of that enough times that it was an easy decision to highlight the work of the team. A campaign is a collection of people doing work. And obviously I worked very hard on this campaign, but we wouldn't have been able to do a fraction of the things we did if it weren't for the people who coordinate our field program. And you mentioned Jenna, who coordinated our policy. And of course, Christina, my campaign manager, held everything together. And people helped on social media. And I think it's important to lift that up because, very often, in campaigns, one of the hardest things for me when I was as a first-time candidate was letting go of the sort of movement speak, which is we, and replacing it with I and me. It's running for office is a very self-absorbed kind of thing. You're always required when you're talking to donors or voters or in forums to say, I did this and that's why I should be elected. But really, no one individual really makes any big impact unless they put a strong team behind them. And so I always thought it was important to highlight the team, A, because they deserved it, but B, just as a reminder that, I mentioned that the progressive DAs aren't superheroes. I mean, in general, people who are elected to office aren't superheroes, right? And honestly, it's a little bit dangerous, I think, that sometimes you see this, I think, as much on the left as you do on the right, that we have sort of hero worship of individual legislators. And, it's...
And then the opposite, too, when they disappoint us, man, do we overreact, right?
Absolutely. And I think, we have to be more equitable on both sides. It's if you see a legislator who's very impressive, they probably have a really good team behind them. And if somebody disappoints, they're probably getting bad counsel in the same way. And so,
or they're thinking longer term, strategic. There's a reason, right?
For sure. Right. Yeah. And so, again, I always liked highlighting the team because, that's really what you're voting for. That's what you're volunteering for, is for a team, not for just one person. And that's, especially true for somebody running for Manhattan DA. I mean, it gives me concern that some people running for Manhattan DA or any major elected office, it might be mayor in this instance in New York or governor, who don't have leadership experience because ultimately, one person can't transform a DA's office. One person can't transform a city government. It can only be a strong team that does. And that's why you want to have a charismatic person on the top of that, but then you also want to make sure it's the kind of person who's going to bring in a good team around them.
Wow. All right. So I have to ask, I'm not going to ask you who those people are, but I do want to know, And I'm also, unless you're ready to, I'm not asking you to endorse anyone either. But if you had to predict who's going to win DA now that you're out and who's going to win the mayor.
Yeah, those are two tough questions. I have not endorsed in the Manhattan DA race, and if I'm going to make an endorsement, it'll be in January. I've spoken with 5 of the candidates since suspending my campaign. They were all, pleasant conversations. I think all the people I spoke with have something positive to offer and something that some area in which, I feel they have a shortcoming. And so I'm going to be sort of taking some time to think about that, probably talk to some other people about, what might come next. If I feel strongly that one of these candidates is better than the other, I do think it's important to get behind that person.
Yeah.
In part because there are other candidates in the race. There's at least one candidate who's going to be extremely well funded, who very much comes from the Cy-Vance, school of fake reform. That I think the left should probably do its best to consolidate and mobilize, to defeat that person. So that's the DA race. I think it'll be fun to watch over the next couple of weeks, and I hope to make an endorsement during that time and see who else does as well. On the mayor's race, I'm totally flummoxed. I've generally been disappointed by most of the candidates. I have some candidates who I'm friends with, who I know are good people, and so this is not personal. This is professional. We have a crisis facing New York City, and I want to see a lot more from whoever's going to try to run this city. I think it's one of the hardest jobs in the country, and we need a really sharp person with good ideas who's gonna handle it. And so far, the part that's been most frustrating is that the next mayor is going to govern through a very difficult time economically, and I want to see somebody who acknowledges that and has some kind of ideas about what to do about that. And I haven't seen that candidate emerge. Like I said, there are some people I like more than others for sure. And I think there are pretty clear boundaries in the mayor's race about who's on the left versus who is clearly running to the center. And so it's not like we have a million choices to choose from, but I think I'm going to take some more time before I decide there too.
Okay, fair enough. So no breaking news right now. All right. So in our last couple minutes, quickly touch on the concept of reform, which typically at best leads to, is another term for incrementalism. We've heard the famous quotes about that. How long do I have to wait for progress? And now that you're not going to be DA, does this mean you'll be pushing for something even more radical, or what are your plans?
I think I was pushing for some pretty radical things.
I do too.
And I'll say this, it was my first time running for office, and one of the things that they tell you is, if you're going to have a message, it has to be the kind of, you can change the wording, you can soften or harden the edges, but especially in 2020, you got to have the same message for every audience. And I took that to heart. When I was doing call time trying to raise money from rich white folks, I would start with the same premise. I'd say, listen, I'm running because I don't believe jail and prison is the answer to society's problems. And that'll get you a lot of hang-ups and skeptical responses, but I felt like I was putting that message forward no matter who the audience was. And so it's easy to talk to you about that, right? But I was saying that same message no matter who I was in front of. And so I was always speaking in line with my values and what I believe in during this campaign. And, so that kind of candor will continue, whatever role I do next. I mean, when it comes to reform, the way I see it is, the question is whether the reform that we're talking about reduces the power and scope and intrusiveness of the criminal legal system in the lives of people, or it just sort of pushes it into another corner, right? Is it like the same volume just being pushed around, or is it shrinking the system? And I think that's really, to me, at a simplistic level, the difference between a good reform and a bad reform, right? Yeah. So it's like, if we're talking about pretrial and we're talking about, well, instead of locking people up, we can have ankle monitors, then to me, that's that's a questionable reform, because
Yeah.
what it's doing is giving judges the option of slapping the ankle monitors on perhaps an even broader set of people than were caught up in the criminal legal system before. So I would say that's a bad reform. If you're talking about, something like the sentencing reforms I was talking about, fewer years in prison across the board, I see that as a good reform, because yes, it still acknowledges that prison exists, and yes, it still means that people will end up in prison, but it means that nobody's going to die in prison of old age. And so
Mhm.
I think that is, a positive reform in the right direction. And we were talking about policing earlier, and I forgot to say this, but now is the right time for it. If you're actually serious about police reform, I think the answer lies not so much in sending a couple bad cops to jail. The answer lies in how do you use that incident, the publicity around that moment, to shrink the size of the police budget so that there's fewer police officers, which matters not only on a day-to-day level of what's happening on the street, but from a political purpose, from a political standpoint. The smaller the police department, the smaller the number of retired police officers and their families, the less political influence they have.
Yes.
Right. So I think, that's another way you can shrink the system via reform. You still, I've never seen across the United States a single budget that eliminates police officers. But if you have fewer of them, you're shrinking the system in the right direction towards abolition. So that to me is how I discern between a good reform and a bad reform. And, I think we have to be honest that everybody, that different actors in the advocacy space are going to play different roles, and that we need to have both people who are pushing the long-term goal. What are we actually aiming for? What is the moral purpose of what we're doing? And we need people who are going to go into that DC situation with the stimulus and be like, hey, we know the stimulus sucks, but can you also get Pell Grants back into prisons, right? Like, I think we'd all agree it's good that Pell Grants are going into prisons, and the people who did that, a couple of whom I know, had to suck it up and be in meetings with people who we might otherwise find distasteful to get the job done. So I really am a firm believer that there's a space for a broad range of people in the advocacy, spectrum.
Well said. All right. So what is next for you? Any ideas yet?
Well, I have to say, after this experience, I'm a little burnt out on dealing with New York politicos. So I would probably want my next project to be something that works in other states and at the federal and national level. I think there's a lot of important work to do. I think Biden-Harris, you mentioned Biden's history, but Biden-Harris did make criminal justice commitments during the campaign. So I think somebody needs to hold them to account for that. And I would love to be involved in something related to getting actual criminal justice reform out of Washington. And then, being liberated, that no longer a candidate who has to go around hat in hand asking for endorsements. I'm ready to be, tough on the mayoral candidates, the DA candidates, city council candidates. I'd like to see some more seriousness out of that group too. So I feel, free to say what's on my mind. So it should be a fun couple of months.
Yeah, that's exciting. I look forward to you without the chains. And we didn't, you mentioned, Harris, but that's the top cop. So, anything that they promised us, definitely needs people like you pushing them to make it happen. I'll be keeping an eye on you. I know you have great things in your future. Thank you for all the work you do and for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. This was a great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Peace.
Bye.